He's country manager at Catalyst Fund. And then we have Ruby Nimka, who is obviously the principal at Greenhouse Capital. I'd like to introduce Sam Obi. Some of the members of the cohort already know him. Is actively working with the startups, and he's a venture partner at Greenhouse Capital. Last but not the least, I'd like to introduce the moderator, Gift Agboro, who is acting deputy director for UK Nigeria Tech Hub. Thank you again. Thank you everyone for joining. Thank you all our panelists for agreeing to do this. Looking forward to actually listening to one of the most impactful sessions of this program, and something very, very important today, which is fundraising in most challenging times. I think that we can all agree that in terms of regulation and in terms of the Africa landscape, there we're obviously going through some challenges, especially how our leaders and some of the regulators are choosing to handle technology businesses today. And I think this is going to be very useful. And I think that beyond this panel, again, this conversation continues to happen, in the background. Again, Gifts, just let you take this away.
Thank you so much, Joshua. Just to be clear that everybody, can everybody hear me?
Yes.
Yes. Can everybody hear me?
Yes, we can hear you.
Oh, okay, great. Thank you so much, Joshua, for that really great introduction and for setting the course for the panelists as we begin the conversation for the panel session, as we all know, titled Fundraising in Challenging Times. So I'll just give room for the panelists to introduce themselves, as well as share a bit of their experience in fundraising. So I'll probably just start by just introducing myself, and then give room for the other panelists to do same. So just as Joshua have said, my name is Gift Agboro. I'm the acting director at the UK Nigerian Tech Hub. The UK Nigerian Tech Hub is an initiative of the UK government to support the Nigerian tech ecosystem. We do a bit of ecosystem building, promoting high-end digital skills, as well as fostering partnerships between the local tech firms here in Nigeria and international businesses. So over to Nosa. I think Nosa is the next person on my screen. So we're going to just do this brief icebreaker. When you introduce yourself, you can say you are passing the mic to, so whosoever is on your screen that you want to pass the mic to, you just call the person, and then till we get to the last panelist on the list. So over to you, Nosa.
Okay, I was worried. I thought you wanted me to sing or something, but yeah, passing the mic is fine. All right, so my name is Nosa Omusi. I'm the Nigeria country manager for BFA Global's Catalyst Fund. Catalyst Fund is an inclusive technology accelerator. We accelerate startups building inclusive tech solutions for underserved segments in emerging markets. And we also accelerate innovation ecosystems. So that includes investors, corporates, startup support organizations. So yeah, really glad to be here. I think it's an interesting time for anybody in the space, and this is an important conversation to have. So glad to be here. And I'll pass the mic to Derek.
Hey everyone, how are you doing? My name's Derek Distenfield. I'm based in California. I co-founded an organization called GSD Venture Studios. We have funds all over the world, from pre-seed accelerator funds to billion-dollar SPACs that we're filing. But I think most relevant for this audience and what I'm excited about is last week, GSD Venture Studios partnered with an Abuja organization, and we're launching a small technology against crime fund in Nigeria. And there'll be an accelerator tied to it where we'll be funding companies from blockchain to drones to cybersecurity that can impact the safety of not just Nigeria and Africa, but around the world. And so we're really excited about that. I've also sat on the other side of the table as an entrepreneur working in failures to billion-dollar exits. And I'm just happy to be here. I'll pass the mic to Ruby.
Thanks, Derek. As you guys all might know, I think I've met a lot of you guys. Ruby here, I am the principal at Greenhouse Capital. As you guys know, we also do direct investments into companies, predominantly within the fintech space, and I manage sort of a team in a fund that does that. I guess, what was the second question, Gift? Really excited to be here, and I agree with Nosa. I think that it's such a relevant conversation around sort of the post-COVID world, how we think about fundraising today, how you guys can access a global network of investors as well. I'm really happy to just be here and talk through some of these pieces. And I'm going to popcorn over to Sam.
Thanks, Ruby. Yeah, happy to be here. I do a lot of work together with the team at Greenhouse. Been doing that for a while. Currently doing some venture work with blockchain.com, helping to invest across the entire Web3 landscape across the world. Also wearing the entrepreneurial hat in Nigeria with a few startups that I founded in the past, Sure Gifts, Busha. So yeah, so I have the good fortune to be able to speak to both sides of the conversation in terms of fundraising and in terms of perspective as an entrepreneur as well, having tried to raise capital in the past via traditional means through angels and VCs, going through an accelerator, the 500 startups back in the days, raising capital from Greenhouse itself, and also investing through Greenhouse and also through my personal vehicle, along with further work, more structured work in the space with blockchain ventures. So I've worked with a lot of you guys already. Looking forward to engaging further. And yeah, I do think it's one of the more critical conversations given the climate on the continent today. I passed the.
Great.
That's it. Back to the panel.
Thank you so much for that introduction. So I guess it's I can say that we can just get the ball rolling, right? Really interested in learning from the other panelists on this panel session, as well as really just sharing insights. So I'll just go over by asking the very first question, and really, the question is just really tied on fundraising, right? With everything that has been happening with regards to fundraising and startup founders actually seeking to raise funds to scale their businesses or to scale whatever ideas that they're working on. What would you say is one silent rule that every founder looking to raise names should be cognizant of? So this question can be addressed by anyone, but Samuel, if you can take the lead on that and just really share your insights as to that one silent rule that you think every startup founder should be cognizant of when they want to raise funds.
Yeah, good, very good and broad question indeed. In terms of what, like a silent rule, what everybody tends to know and not speak about, it's the, I guess the soft factors that really tend to affect the fundraising process. So a lot of folks get into the transaction, into the flow with very idealistic mindsets where they have a lot of fundamental work figured out. The deck is solid, the project makes a ton of sense based on a ton of research and all of that stuff. But the reality of the game of the industry is that there are lots of other factors that really affect the closing of the transaction that beyond the fundamentals of the business. So besides the the important things around ensuring that the business model is solid, ensuring that you're talking to the right investors with the right strategic fit and all of these things, it's also important to try to optimize around those soft factors that play to the positive side of the people's biases that you're working with. And those things include a lot of things around affiliations that you're able to broker, and that's sort of things you're working through with the accelerator, personal branding, posturing, PR, all of these things, even the design, your your media presence, in terms of like how potential users perceive you, and all of these things are the cues that a lot of investors tend to pick up when you introduce yourself via cold email. I tend to do it as well, go to Twitter, see who are these guys, and then all of those things just sort of form the foundation of how you're going to perceive the company before you even look at the deck. And those things sort of form how you analyze it, where you can have the two exact businesses doing the exact same thing with the exact same traction and the exact same approach and vision, but you have a strong conviction from one over the other, specifically because of this or that sort of factor. So it will be good to sort of figure out what those are, and then optimize for them. That'll be what I'll say, one of the hidden open secrets in this space.
Thank you so much, Samuel. Nosa, do you have anything to drop, any insights to drop on that bit?
Yeah, so when it comes to things that are maybe not so obvious, I think one of them is just that around every fundraising journey, it's important for you to sort of be able to understand and map your risks, right? Like the risks that that the risks you face along that fundraising journey. There's so many things that are obvious. You look at your product, you look at the investment landscape, who's aligned, who's investing in your space. You look at standing, those things are obvious. But I think a lot of times, founders need to take a step back and really ask themselves, what are the risks that I'm really exposed to along this journey, right? What happens if for some reason I'm not able to even raise, this fundraising journey gets pushed back, right? We saw a lot of those things happen, especially during COVID. There were people who said, oh, you know what, I have 6 months runway, so you know what, I'll start raising, 6 months to go, I'll close in 6 months. But then, all of a sudden, there's this force majeure happens, right? And time, it changes, and you now start asking yourself, how do I optimize to even run, increase my run rate? So the risks are so many and so varied. Let's even talk about things like regulatory risks, right? It's one thing to be in keeping with the regulations as they exist, but regulation is not a goalpost, right? Regulation is a moving target. There are certain things that will happen, certain things that happen in the economy, certain things that will happen with, the currency, with all sorts of things, and these will change the way regulators perceive certain things. So, what are those risks that you are exposed to? And if those risks actually occur, how do you adapt your strategy to mitigate those? And apart from even just risks around fundraising and regulation, there are even risks around competitor action, right? And building this particular product. Obviously, there's no idea that is original, right? There's somebody else out there who might see this as a threat. Should they decide to take action or act in a certain way, how do I respond to this? Or even if it's even a positive risk, even if they decide that, I want to sort of collaborate, how do you respond to this? So I think underneath every fundraising journey, there are always risks. And I think founders need to always be cognizant of what those risks are and be very conscious about having strategies to respond to them.
Yeah, I think Nosa. Oh, go ahead.
Okay, yeah, sure. Ruby, you can have the floor.
No, I was just going to quickly jump on. I think, Nosa, one of the key things that you've mentioned is just being really strategic around managing the fundraise overall and being really sort of organized around it, trying to anticipate, some of the risks or some of the things that may come up. One of the other things that I think is actually quite an interesting topic, and I think people kind of debate back and forth around this, but especially in earlier fundraisers, it's having when you are really interested, when you're really trying to fundraise, you're really trying to make sure that you can get to the next level of growth. You're really trying to make sure that you're not burning cash through your own pockets. I think often we're much more inclined to be able to accept any money that comes through the door because we are not necessarily desperate, but we are, trying to just push our businesses forward. And I think, sometimes it's really important to also do due diligence on the investor themselves as well. So someone who's coming to the table, what are they able to bring to you guys as well? Are they somewhat strategic? Can they bring network? Can they bring know-how? Are they going to be heavily involved in the business, or can they actually have the capacity to be involved in the business? Do they have maybe things like subject matter expertise? And I think some of these things, if you can bring the right people on, and it doesn't have to be every investor that comes through the door, but picking and choosing the 1 or 2 key people who are going to advocate for you in the market in a really thoughtful way and in an intentional way, I think can help and go a long way. And I think a really good example is, we, at least at Greenhouse, we've had certain portfolio companies where we followed the founders, and actually Sam's an amazing example of that. We followed the founders through multiple businesses because you're starting to build a relationship, you're able to help on multiple different fronts, as opposed to sort of looking for investors that maybe, are able to give you the capital, but maybe not much else. And so also being strategic around the types of investors and really conducting your own due diligence on the investor is important as well.
Yeah, I love the word strategic. And I think that there's so many different kind of verticals or spokes that you could come off that hub. But I think one of the things that Sam was talking about and Nosa is there's like kind of a strategy that I call straight line selling. And I think when you're pitching, you're really pitching yourself as the founder, you're pitching your team, and you're pitching your product all in parallel. And I oftentimes see founders focusing only on one of those lines and then using words like, I do this, and not telling me how your team is functioning, or they over index on their team because one of the guys has a PhD or is famous, but they forget to tell me the product. And I really think it needs to happen all in parallel. The other thing on the strategic side is, we want to see that you're addressing the reality today. I mean, I don't see this so much anymore in the last 6 months, but if I don't see in a deck that you're mentioning COVID and somehow, that just tells me that you're not following the times and you're not updating your strategy. And the last thing I think also is having a clear understanding why you're raising money. And why are you raising $1 million? Is it $1 million because that's a guaranteed article in TechCrunch? And what are those 3 or 4 things that you're actually going to achieve? And why do you need money to do that? And a lot of times I play the 5 whys with founders to really dig deep into understanding why they need money to add users. I mean, explain that and really be able to articulate that to me. Is something that I think kind of hubs off that strategic word.
Thank you so much. So just to mention, Derek, from what you said, I know that there is the strategic angle, right, that startup founders need to explore when trying to raise funds. But with your experience in, delivering growth strategies for some of the portfolio companies that you've worked with, what would you say are some of the worst mistakes that you've seen founders, some of these mistakes that founders usually make when they prepare to raise funds?
Well, I think that, and where do you begin? But one is, I think simply they over-index on paid digital search. A lot of times I'll see founders say, like, this is going to be my CAC. I'm going to have a low CAC. I'm going to be able to acquire customers. I think most investors and most growth marketers have seen over and over again where low CAC doesn't scale. And so explaining to me how that's scalable and how you understand that, just because you've been able to acquire 1,000 customers at $1 each doesn't mean you can acquire 1 million at that. Like it just doesn't scale that way in my experience. And so I think over-indexing there. I think another thing is I also see founders just not really have a growth strategy. I can't tell you how many times I see a deck where it's like my go-to-market plan or my growth strategy is PR, social media, direct sales, word of mouth, and just has some icons on it that looks clean, but you actually haven't laid anything out for me. I want to know, what is your KPI for this round and what is your actual path to get there? If your KPI is $1 million in ARR, tell me the path on how you're going to get there and how you're going to use those things and what is the actual strategy. And then how does that scale up to 100 million or $1 billion in the future? And I don't always see that. You're muted, Gift. Is she muted for you guys, or?
Yeah.
Oh, yes. Apologies. I
No
kept
worries.
talking. I didn't realize
I'm
that
glad it was
on
you
mute.
and not me. For a second, I thought maybe I was muted.
Thank you so much, Derek, for that, great overview, sharing your own experience with, developing growth strategies for companies and, also stating some of the mistakes that startup founders, make when they, go on fundraising. So I'll probably just allow Ruby to also drop a couple of cents in that particular conversation. So what are some of the worst mistakes that you've seen startup founders make when they go?
Yeah, I think I definitely plus one or echo Derek around just being ultra clear in what you're. Sorry, Gift, are you still talking? Can you guys hear me okay?
Yes,
Okay,
I can hear you.
Okay, cool. Yeah, just being ultra clear and being really being transparent in what you guys have achieved so far, the vision of the business. I think in many cases, we also get really excited about the prospects of the business and the vision of the business, which is really important. But as it said, sort of having the clarity on what you're going to be tackling first, right? So an example being, let's say you're trying to build a digital bank and you want to be building in, or you're trying to build like a WeChat super app. It does lending and e-commerce and insurance and blah blah blah, and it does all these amazing things. But that's not what it looks like within the next 12 to 18 months. And that vision is super important, but also understanding how we're going to get there is really important as well. And if you can have some of that clarity, I think other mistakes I've seen is, I would say, almost overcompensating on the sort of valuations of the business, for example. So what we've seen recently are companies that maybe are just starting on their revenue, they're just trying to figure out their product market fit, they're very early in the journey, and suddenly they're presenting themselves as a $20 million company. And in an investor's mind, I think if there's ultra clarity on how you're getting there and there's a plan and you can see the demonstrated track record of how you're doing that, maybe it can be justifiable. But making sure that you have the ability to justify it, not just based on the comparables or not just based on the market sentiment, I think is really important, because what that means is you end up getting into a situation where maybe the investor comes back and says, actually, we want to maybe value you guys at X amount, which is 50% of what you've presented to us. You yourself are now starting to, there's almost a sort of alignment in what you're presenting back to the market and what you're actually worth. And you sort of end up coming back with a little bit of, not resentment, but you kind of, there's just kind of misalignment there, right? And so being able to really back your numbers is super important. I think some of that stuff you guys had kind of gone through during our finance conversations and so on recently. But if you can walk the investor through the thinking process of why you believe your business is valued at XYZ, it helps a lot. Yeah, I'm trying to think where else. I guess maybe Sam, have you What are some of the lessons learned? Sorry, Gift. I'm going to ping a question over
It's
to Sam,
right.
if that's okay.
Yeah, it's all
What are
right.
some of the things that you guys had learned from the first business you created for, solving for the next business that you've built when you've gone through that initial fundraising?
Yeah, you're right. The market was sort of way different back then, where there's a lot more rationality around valuations at the time. Now that point you've made is pretty strong, where a lot of folks are inundated with a bunch of news here and there, and then they tend to anchor the business logic or the business model or plan or investment process around what's going on around them. I think it's important to just look inwards to your business and sort of what are specific needs that you need, and apply that without sort of where folks are tend to be raising at these days, or what's the base valuation for a YC company, a lot of these things. I think back then, it was more bottom up in terms of like how we grew the business. So the first check was it was 2 million naira back there, from VGG, and then as the business scaled and we sort of validated the model, we're able to sort of pull more funds from that source, at a higher, more justifiable valuation, and things were a little more fundamental, I'll say back then. And sort of what I was saying is different today versus then, was that we are a bit more realistic about the market that we are operating in. So we also sort of got lost in I think back then it was the e-commerce was the big news at the time. And similarly to how you have digital banks or crypto and all these things being the news for today, we got lost in that news process, and everybody wanted to do e-commerce then, wanted to do it as well, and we didn't really sort of do deep enough amount of work understanding what we're really trying to get into, what it would take to really deploy, whether or not we're really equipped to do it right, and whether or not there was a future in the entire industry in the first place. Are the customers there? Do we have to invest a lot of money in education in the first place, or is there latent demand that we can tap into? So we had we had too many dreams that we didn't really put in enough sort of rigorous work into defining exactly how to actualize. I think going into the next business that we did, we lost all of the illusions that we were under in the first place. Where we've sort of realized exactly how hard it is to deploy and scale in this market, and our mindset is really to go with the path where you have the least resistance. What's the easiest thing to do to make the highest amount of money in the shortest amount of time? That was the logic that we sort of approached the next business. And you find that you'd build a massive infrastructure for if you look at short games, for example, we built a massive system where integrated with a bunch of merchants, e-commerce merchants, Jumia, Spar. We are the tools of Spar. Do you know what it takes to get into the checkout systems of a company like that over the course of 3-4 years? Give them a float, build hardware, POSs at the stores, and for what really? For to then go out and sell a digital voucher that you have to sort of define for the market and create a new category. And then it all seemed good when you look at it how it is in the US, but it wasn't really for the market. And while now we've been able to build something decent out of it, where it's now profitable, is doing okay. There are dozen other things we could have done with half the effort, and if we had more clarity on the market, that could have returned a ton of value to us as founders and to our investors as well. So I think it's good to sort of get a good sense of exactly how hard it is the work would be, and to be realistic about how much value one can extract out of it before really dipping into it. And then that will define exactly how much you need to raise, whether or not you need to have tolerance to lose money for a while. And then you find yourself that, hey, you don't have to be it's just trying to figure something that is too hard out for a number of years. You're starving, you can't raise, and then your dream cannot really translate into real life value immediately. So yeah, so I'll say just understanding the market that you're playing in, and optimizing for the path of least resistance will be the lessons we've taken over the years. And that's why our lives are much easier today than it was a few years ago.
Thank you very much, Samuel, for that really insightful addition on that particular question. So I would want us to take perhaps just lean back into capacity building, right? When Derek was speaking, he made a point as to founders, when they pitch to investors, he realized that one of the mistakes they make is not pitching parallel to themselves as a founder, the product that they're trying to get funding for, as well as that of the team. So the burning question that I want us to also get to talk about and explore during this particular session would be, and this is in particular addressed to Nosa, because I know that Catalyst Fund and you guys have done quite a number of investment readiness programs for startup founders who are interested to build a capacity on that bit. So the question would be, how would you advise these founders who are trying to get pre-seed funding and also currently in their seed stage funding? What would be your advice to them in terms of becoming more investor ready, putting in mind the statement that Derek made with regards to pitching with that parallel mindset?
Okay, thanks for that. So I can actually think of a number of things like strategies, right? I think one of the biggest ones is, and I think it's similar to the comments that Ruby shared in the chat, like, just product validation, market validation, anything that you are selling, any story that you are telling, you need to have some strong numbers that actually tell people that this is true, right? This is obtainable. I mean, in those days, people weren't as, there was a time when people weren't so cognizant about, the realities of our markets. You could sort of use numbers around, the youthfulness of the population, people that live in Lagos, and extrapolate and come out with some attractive looking TAM numbers and things like that. But people are a lot wiser now, right? You need to really be able to validate those numbers, be able to really speak to what's the size of that market, who you're appealing to, and yeah, just basically having a firm grasp of your numbers. And when we talk about numbers too, I think a lot of startups do not make the requisite investments into how they manage their finances, right? You see a startup building exceptional products, but then, they have like someone with very little experience who's actually handling the finances, right? There isn't somebody who is able to, really present those numbers, really put together detailed financial plans. So just making that investment also in their numbers, and even in their data room. I think a lot of times with startups, when we ask for things like data rooms and all that, you always find out that there's a lot of stuff that is lacking there. I think also one of the strategies as well that I think has worked pretty well in recent times is just being able to, and it's similar to something Derek said, you need to be able to understand, you need to be able to read the sign of the times, and you need to be reflective of that timing in the way you make your pitch and even in the way you are selling your product. So let me give you an example. So like during COVID, for example, right, there was this wave where we saw, people going remote. There was a wider appetite for sort of like use of digital platforms, from agency banking to mobile banking. There was like more users coming on board, conferencing platforms. So you need to be able to have a sense of what is important to people at that time. So if it is things that have to do with, relying on digital infrastructure, then you need to be able to tell a story that factors that in. If you have things like the pandemic and the rest that have impact on other businesses, you need to be able to say how that is either a positive for you, and if it's a negative, how are you dealing with that? In today's climate, you need to be able to show compliance right? Because so many people have been burnt with the raft of regulation and things that come around. So you know that more people who are looking at this space are beginning to ask themselves more questions around compliance, and if you have certain issues around regulatory permissions and regulatory actions of regulators, how are you going to mitigate against those things? And then even just even being a lot more cash efficient now, right? Fundraising rounds, there are so many, the number of people trying to get funding has increased. Investors are taking a lot more time to look through deals. People are being more careful. So just even how you plan your use of cash during that period, like you must always have it at the back of your mind that these rounds may not close as quickly as you want them to be. It's not like people are flying around the world and I can go to a cafe and run into a bunch of investors just sitting down, and I can talk to 3-4 different people in the same day. Things like the world's a bit different now. So just being cognizant of some of those realities is important. And like I said, going into aligning yourself.
I think I lost.
Did you lose me?
I heard you.
Yes, we lost you. Yeah, we lost you, Nosa. Can you hear us?
Yes, I can hear you guys.
Okay, yes, we can hear you now, so you can continue.
Okay, so yeah, so I think those are some of the strategies and some of the things we see, and we are constantly trying to talk to founders about being more deliberate, being more deliberate about.
I think we lost you again.
Hello.
Okay, but just to be sure, can everybody else hear me?
Can everybody else hear me?
Yeah,
I heard you.
We had you the entire time. Don't worry.
Yeah, you're good.
I think maybe it's got something to do with your connection, because we can hear on our side.
Hello.
Yeah, we hear. Here, I'll. Where's her?
I think one other question that I think might be useful, Nosa, I think you really touched on the compliance and regulation piece just while Gift is connecting back in. I'm curious to hear, some of your experiences, Nosa, with some of your portfolio companies, Derek as well with some of your portfolio companies, and Sam in your own personal experience. This idea, and I think I chatted it just now. So this idea of asking for forgiveness from the regulator later, once you've become bigger, we can often do that in really developed markets. And a lot of young companies fly under the radar of the regulator until they're large enough and then look at applying for the right regulatory licenses. What we found is obviously in Nigeria and many other countries across Africa, that concept of asking for forgiveness doesn't really always work. We see that in the crypto space. We've seen that in the e-mobility space within Nigeria. We've more recently seen that with the B2C investment apps. And so just kind of curious to hear, thoughts there. How should some of our companies in the program really be thinking about it? Can they prepare for it at all? And should they be thinking about a plan B? What's your sort of general thinking and direction there?
Yeah, I think that's a very good question. So my answer to that will be, so let's look at the space and the way it has evolved, right? So last year, if you look at the numbers, I think in the whole of last year, startups probably raised about 1.6 billion, right? In Africa, $1.6 billion. Currently, I think we're past 1.7, right? So there's a lot of money coming into the space, and the year is not even over. So in Nigeria alone, 70% of that funding has come to fintech, right? So when you become this big, like how really do you want to fly under the radar, right? Like the days of flying under the radar are gone. Now everyone is constantly, looking out on the lookout, like, okay, these people seem to be, having a lot of funding. There's also a lot of, even competitor action, right? The banks are also beginning to flag that, this thing, if you don't regulate this thing could become a bubble. Unfortunately, especially in Nigeria, we have a track record of instability in our financial services space, whether it's from defunct banks or challenges with microfinance institutions or depositors being able to access their deposits. So there are all these things. But one of the things that I think has worked well, and I'll use an example of a company in our portfolio. So one company is Cowrywise. One of the things that has worked very well is right from the beginning of their journey, they kept very close relationships with their regulator, which specifically is the Security and Exchange Commission. And you could see that even as the regulation was changing, they were always aware of where that regulation was going. You know, they were actually a lot of times even talking with the regulators and saying, okay, you know what, this could possibly work, this might probably not work. I don't know how much of that input, of course, the regulator acted on, but ultimately they were able to actually even get licensed, you know, pretty much one of the first SEC licenses that actually came out for companies that were doing, you know, asset management and savings and investment. So I think being able to have an active relationship with your regulator and probably even a process owner like on your team, right? I think we see a lot of fintechs now looking at, you know, government relations or, you know, regulatory affairs type roles. So being able to keep a pulse on that is very useful. And then have those relationships so that you can sort of be able to react sort of as those things are changing and even be part of the conversation. I think the sort of insurgent mindset that we had in the past where it's like, oh, we're just these bunch of guys doing our thing and, you know, eventually, you know, we'll beat the system. I think we need to start reevaluating that and now start asking ourselves, how can we work with the system? How can we actually influence things sort of like in real time?
I think for me, it's also about understanding where the power lies in different countries. I mean, I've been to Nigeria once, spent 9 days there, and I know that if the CBN tells you to do something, you probably should do it, and nothing good is going to happen if you circumvent it. I think that there's a lot of kind of auras, especially in the US, where there's been disruptors that have kind of begged for forgiveness. But I would say that there's probably only been about 20, maybe 25 in the history of the US that have been successful and pulled that off. And we can name them all. And it makes you think that it's just so easy to thumb your nose at a regulator. But I think it has to do with where the power lies. And the example would be in Nigeria, it's very obvious to me, at least, that the CBN has a lot of power. And I wouldn't buck that. But maybe there's a traffic commission that has less power where you might be able to take advantage of it. Just like in the US, there's been several disruptors, but it's very obvious with the Theranos case that you don't mess with the FDA. And so like, that's just like something you have to learn from as an entrepreneur, where the power lies in the jurisdiction you're trying to expand in, and you're trying to push that needle. The last thing is, just like there is a competitive moat for asking for forgiveness, there's also a competitive moat of going through the hassle or the difficulty of regulators and getting baked in the right way, because that's a competitive advantage, because not everyone is able and willing to do that. So those are just some points that come to mind, but I think it's it's an entrepreneur's dilemma. It's not easy to figure out.
Thank you. My sincere apologies. My internet went out, and Ruby graciously stepped in for me. Thank you so much, Ruby. So while we are trying to wrap up this conversation, one other question that I would also like us to talk about would be really just centered around fundraising bias, right? When it comes to gender and then, geographic setting. As we may all know, the African Development Bank, brought a report that really just stated that there is a funding gap that amounts to $42 billion between startups founded by females and the startup founded by males, right? And then there've been quite a number of research in that regards as well. It was stated that out of only 3.2% of the total capital that was invested in Africa within the first quarter of 2020, right, only went to startups with at least one female co-founder or leader. So there is this, continuous conversation with regards to the funding gap that exists. So the question here would be, what are your thoughts, right? And I would really appreciate if everybody on the panel, really gets to drop one or two thoughts that they have in this particular regards. What are your thoughts around this gender-specific bias and geographic setting perspective as well? And what are the ways do you think some key players can do, or what are the things do you think they can do to help eliminate this bias that already exists? So Ruby, do you want to go first, and then you could pass the mic to whoever person that you want to pass the mic to?
Yeah, I think it's a really challenging because we all as individuals think there are a couple of things that we probably all are already aware of that we also, as some of us or some of you guys being founders, may also experience, right? I think women entrepreneurs is definitely a major issue in terms of lack of funding. And I think that's kind of over time can be resolved by having more women investors also on the other side of the table and creating more kind of stronger networks, having advocates, within your teams that speak for women founders, and you guys as founders as well, being conscious of having even in your hiring, making sure that you guys are hiring leadership that is gender diverse, geographically diverse, and diverse in as many kind of aspects as possible. I think as you guys kind of build your companies, you'll find actually the more diverse your teams are, often the more interesting output, creative output, productive output you end up having. I think that's sort of the first thing. But I think beyond that, you probably will find that actually, depending on where the investors sit as well, they'll end up being inherent assumptions and biases that you'll probably experience. One is you'll probably experience an Africa discount, I'm sure, although hopefully that narrative is slowly changing. And what that essentially says is, Africa's definitely not the same as, other countries. There's too many hurdles there. Therefore, generally you're already on the back foot when you're trying to raise and looking at the amount that you're looking to raise as well. I think you'll find that other forms of bias can also come in in any, as I said, it could be race, it could be geographic, it could be gender. It could be maybe you're not even starting a fintech company and every investor is looking for a fintech company these days. And so somehow you're trying to justify how your business is becoming a fintech company. Actually, if it's not, it's okay. But actually being able to justify that business and what it is super important. And educating the investor on that is super important. And then I think also other types of biases can also be, as you're looking for, if you're a Kenyan founder, for example, and a lot of investors in that region are impact investors, and so that you're coming in with, are they an impact investor? Are you kind of tweaking your entire mindset to say, hey, I'm solving this sustainable development goal? It's interesting in terms of what we see in Nigeria, for example, where most of the decks that we're getting in Nigeria will never talk about their sustainable development goals. And all the decks that we end up getting from Kenya always talk about their sustainable development goals, right, according to the investor. But I also think it's important to educate the investor to say, hey, actually, you may not necessarily only be looking for, a certain type of capital. And if you are, knowing kind of what you're going into is important. But I'm actually more curious to hear, I guess, Sam's example, and also from the audience as well, what has been your experience when you've had to raise, and how have you addressed some of the biases, especially being an African founder?
There's a real bias there for sure. There's undeniable in the data where it's way tougher to go out there and try to raise capital as an African founder without all of these signals that one would need to tag on to at least remove that air. Some of these include the elite degrees, all of this foreign co-founders, but it's even doubly difficult for women, because even if you're white or black or African, women founders tend to have it way more difficult. So I have been in a woman African founder is just a pain in the fundraising process. Unfortunately, biases and prejudices is stuff that is real, and it's not going anywhere. It's stuff that is always gonna exist, and it's stuff that we need to actively work towards dancing around or eliminating. And as Ruby said, to solve a lot of the problems, we probably need to solve it ourselves as well. The reason why we're having this conversation is mostly because a lot of the capital is foreign. So a lot of the folks tend to invest in people who look like them, who went to the same schools as they did, who sound just like them. So if we want to have more capital flowing into Africa, we need more African capital allocators. If you want more capital flowing to women, you need more female capital allocators as well. So these things tend to really we need to solve for those issues from the top down. And on the bottom up perspective as well, the pipeline is really not good as well. You're looking at 20 decks, 19 out of 20 will be from male founders with all male teams. So it will be great, if suddenly we're seeing 1 in 2 decks has the primary founder as a female. That would be quite an interesting and very odd development today. So if we need to really work on building that pipeline as well. And being a startup founder or trying to go into entrepreneurship is a high risk venture. It takes a lot of bandwidth from you, and that's probably the reason why you don't tend to see not a lot of women there, because they have fewer societal safety nets to sort of support that venture. It's much harder today for a woman to venture out and say, hey, I want to start a business and I'm gonna sleep on my uncle's couch for a week to sort that out, or sleep in a hostel with 5 other guys on the floor while hacking something out on a computer. And there's just no buffers around for women to really thrive in the high risk, dangerous, unstable entrepreneurial environment that we have in Africa, unlike many other markets in the West. So I think having dedicated programs like Greenhouse did a while ago, where it was optimized for female selection, it was optimized for providing all of those sort of support structures around those categories of founders is very useful. And also, as she said as well, diversity on the team could be useful when building for the market that have female population as half of the population. So that could be very helpful to select a co-founder as well. It's really an interesting dynamic when you look at teams with female co-founders. Look at Piggy, you look at Biocoins. There seems to be a certain amount of value to that one cannot deny as well. So I think there's problems to fix on both sides, on several fronts. That it's just very, very hard to really pinpoint a singular solution to. But I think it's a major problem. And even from my perspective as an African founder, I think the first way to really attack it is to realize that, hey, the game is the game. This is where I'm approaching this meeting knowing fully well that I'm going in there with a bit disadvantaged, you know. By recognizing that, you know, I have my expectations that I'm not going to feel disappointed after the call, and then I play to exactly what they need to learn. You know, if they need to hear, and I can go into those meetings attacking those strong points that they will want to, you know, that will really, you know, form their biases. And I go like, hey, you know, the market is big. I'm equally as competent as the other guy. You know, the other guy is doing this, I'm doing that better. And they're just recognizing those biases and then trying to attack them directly without really complaining about it and just, you know, feeling bad if things happen or otherwise. But yeah, you can't really, you know, blame folks who are allocating capital, because it's a human condition to really tag on to folks who look like you, and everybody will do the same in their position as well. So I tend not to really blame that, but I really to work on, you know, creating resources on our side as well. Yeah, that's my approach to the problem.
Yeah, I think very valid points made. I think on our side, what we've seen, and just to reiterate, these two biases, especially the one around gender, around geographic bias, I think are really huge and pressing problems. On our side, what we have tried to do is deliberately set up certain criteria that actually do encourage investments in businesses that have female founders. So the way it's hard, like for example, in the Catalyst Fund, it's hard coded. We know when evaluating any business, we deliberately look out for businesses that have female founders. Our last cohort had female founders in the whole founding team. So the last cohort that interestingly had one of the greenhouse portfolio companies, so in the Sina. We also had companies like Lamy, people like Koa. So I think it's important that on this continent as investors, and I guess with VCs who are probably not based here, you may not hold them to such high standards, but I think for those of us who are actually trying to invest in the ecosystem, we need to kind of like hard code how to, surmount some of those biases. We need to make an active effort to look out for female founders. All the research out there shows that, more diverse teams are able to create more diverse products. And we also know that these biases are real. I think everybody has seen the Harvard Business Review study, like female founders actually get asked more preventive questions versus promotional questions that go to their male colleagues, right? So for those of us who are really invested on the continent, we need to hard code this into our selection criteria. On the part of the geographic bias too, I think similar thing as well. There was a study recently done, or some data that was published by one of my colleagues, Maxime Bayan, with someone called Max Covelia. And I think it was two-thirds of founders who have raised funding in Africa since 2019 actually have schooled abroad, or versus the other 1/3 that schooled or haven't left the continent too. So even at Catalyst Fund too, we also deliberately do look out for local founders. And again, I'll also say that for those of us investors, accelerator programs that are invested on the continent, we need to make an active effort to look out for teams that have local founders. And I'd even just going to B's point also about, kind of like the bottom-up approach. I think we also need to take this beyond ourselves down to, even the angel networks, right? Like the very earliest investors, because those guys, without knowing it, shape a lot of this pipeline that we see. So if you are not actively trying to catalyze those angel networks and those people who will be the first port of call, I'll tell you that most of the, if the female decks are not getting through, then people like us will never even see them at all, right? So I think it's also important that we actually actively make efforts to catalyze our own angel investment ecosystems. It's something that we need to invest in on the continent, to be able to be sure that there's a bottom-up approach and we're actually creating a more equitable, more diverse pipeline of companies, both in terms of gender and geographic distribution as well.
Thank you very much, Nosa. Derek, do you have anything you'd like to contribute as well?
Yeah, I mean, I agree with everyone's comments, and I think it's a very difficult situation, and certainly difficult in the United States. But one of the things that we try to do, and where I've seen venture capitalists excel in actually kind of putting their money where their mouth is, because I think there's a lot of lip service, but I think number one is what you reward a founder for when you're grading a founder. And one of the things that I try to do is not overemphasize on like masculinity, on how well somebody pitches, which I think are two things that are ingrained to male founders, and being an extrovert. And this is just, how do you be diverse and putting race aside? But if you're only going to fund masculine extroverts that can nail the pitch perfectly without stuttering, you're never going to grow as an investor. And so I mean, we've invested in 24 countries now, and about 85% of it has been outside of the US. 100% of it has been outside of Silicon Valley. And believe me, if I graded people's pitch, and that was the decision I made, like, do they sound perfectly like me? Do I understand every word? Is that, what you would see, on the Facebook movie? No. So I think it's just what you grade as a good pitch. Another thing where I've seen, we haven't necessarily adopted this yet, but we probably should and will, is why does the pitch even have to be live anymore? What's wrong with saying to a founder, send me a 5-minute, 10-minute recording of your pitch, and if I like it, I'll call you, and let them practice it. I mean, if a founder has to practice a pitch because they're a little nervous, or maybe English isn't their first language, or maybe they've never pitched a VC, that does not mean that they're not a good leader. It does not mean that they don't have a good startup, and it does not mean that they haven't recruited a good team. It just means that they're not an extrovert, or they don't pitch every day, or it's a little intimidating. And so I think creating different ways that we judge and interact founders is the only way that we could expand on who we're funding. And so those are just some thoughts that I think about.
Thank you so much, Jarek. Just to also drop a couple of comments on that bit. I totally loved Samuel's comments on attacking it from both sides. So it also trying to increase more female founders and enabling them to start businesses and scale. We also need to see more female investors, more female angel investors who are also there listening to these founders, and where there's a need to drop a check or even provide mentorship. Because one thing I've gotten to understand lately is, with fundraising, it doesn't just end with the money. Just like what Ruby said, you want to look out for investors who would be sort of like also invested in the growth of your company, who can provide insights when you need it, who can provide some sort of mentorship based on, their sector specific interest in that particular business that you're seeking to scale. And just made me just to echo some of the work that we are doing at the UK Nigerian Tech Hub to see how we can also promote that local investment from African investors or African angel investors who are seeking for local startups to actually invest in. So now that we're wrapping up the conversation, I want to lean on Nosa's comment on the chat box that said Derek is 100% on the money. So let's talk a bit about money, right? So when it comes to the funds or the checks, the size of the check that you are willing to drop in different instances, how big and how small, right, do you see those checks to be, and what drives your decision? Say, for example, you see a startup founder who pitched to you, and you have a certain amount of figure that you want to invest in that particular startup? What drives that particular decision with regards to the amount of money that you're willing to drop as an investor? So Derek, you can go first, and then Nusa, and then down to Ruby.
Maybe I want to be incredibly honest, and I think this will be most helpful, at least for me, and I think it's most common, but maybe doesn't get said enough. What drives the check size is what I've told my LPs that I was going to write and formed a thesis around. And I think it's very important to understand that if, so for example, the fund that I put together with Jerry Akuba out of Abuja that I mentioned, we are going to write checks for 10,000 to 100,000 in that range. So if you ask me for $1 million, it's just not going to come. But we also have larger funds where we've explained to our LPs what they are. So I think first it's what your thesis is, and what we all have spreadsheets, where we think, 30% of our fund will be home runs, 2 or 3 will be average, and the rest will fail. And we kind of build a thesis around that. But I think the second answer is, how much does the founder ultimately need? And what are they using it for? And I think, I don't want to speak for all VCs, but definitely in Silicon Valley and definitely from us, one of the biggest conflicts I see is I invest for growth and founders raise to feed their families and to stay alive and keep their business open. And that's actually 2 different things. So they need to keep the lights on. I want to pour gas on the fire when it's already been lit. And that's where I think that there's a little bit of conflict. So I want to invest the least amount of money to make the most where I know it's going towards growth. I mean, that's just being real and honest. So hopefully that helps.
Yeah, thank you. Nosa, how about you? What drives?
So for us, we're very much supported by donors. Our fund is basically donor-led. So I think one of the things is in terms of the check size. This is also determined by a donor. So similar to Derek, so you can think of the donors as our own LPs, right? So and these donors are GPMC, DFID, and then recently PayPal as well. So that's pretty much determined by them. So it's a fixed amount. However, what determines who we give this to is also around our investment thesis, which we have also kind of co-created with these donors, right? So for us, especially our inclusive fintech fund, we're always looking for inclusive solutions, right? Solutions that are able to impact underserved segments. So it doesn't matter what your solution is, it must be able to impact underserved segments, must be able to improve livelihoods, must be able to improve financial health. We also look at things like, like I mentioned, female founders, having local founders. We also have something we call additionality. And this is very key for us, because for us, the way we see our additionality means, because we don't only just invest, we also have this, this venture building, this bespoke venture building program that we do for 6 months. So it's not just about who we can give money to, it's also about who can we move from points, from point Y to Z, where Y to Z is an incremental, right? So how do we actually make sure that we're not just giving you money, but we also have enough skill sets that when we work with you as a team, we can actually create a difference. We can literally accelerate your growth. So for us, if we don't see a clear case for additionality where we can actually make an impact or make a difference in the company, then we're not going to invest, because for us, it's beyond just capital, right? We also want to be able to actually use our technical expertise to move that needle.
Thank you so much, Nosa. Samuel, do you want to drop 1 or 2 contributions?
No, I think it's pretty much all well covered. It's way more experience in that direction than I am as allocators. To the first question around that, sometimes you a lot of things that determine the quantum of the check that is deployed, you know, as most of the time, as Derek said, is, you know, it's your mandate. You know, you really can deploy more than you have, or more than you're sort of mentally positioned to deploy. But, you know, there are some some things that make you super convicted about the product, that, you know, you are really willing to dig in deeper and just, you know, participate even beyond the capital. And that's really where I think it's important to get the founders to align with investors with even more so than the capital, where, you know, even if they're able to deploy only a little, you know, you try to be strategic with who you try to bring on board, where, you know, these guys are in it with you almost side by side to fight these battles. So there should be pretty much, what I'm trying to say is really that, you know, less of an emphasis on the check size or on the money, beyond how these guys can really help. Because, you know, I found in my own personal journey that, you know, it's become more important, where, you know, money eventually becomes a commodity that, you know, if you have the numbers, if you have the clout, you will find, and where it's really difficult to really get the support and the resources with the people that you bring on board. And those guys can really make or mar the business, where, you know, take a lot of capital from the wrong folks, it's a guaranteed, you know, guaranteed decimation of your business down the line. Take a little money from the right folks, and then you're pretty sure that they're going to hack it out with you, and you're going to make sure that you succeed in the way you're going to enjoy, and they are going to be able to go out happy as well. So yeah, I think, you know, being careful about where and how much you take from the right category of people is an important thing to take away from the entire fundraising process.
Thank you very much, Samuel. Ruby, I'm not sure if you can hear me, but if you can, do you have one or two comments that you'd like to drop on that bit before I hand over to Joshua?
Yeah, so I'm just looking at the question in your chat. Can you guys hear me?
Not so well, Ruby.
It's breaking.
Oh no. Okay,
Oh wait, now you're
maybe
better.
I'll just type my answer. Maybe I can just type my answer to that.
Okay, great. So thank you very much, Nosa, Derek, Samuel, and Ruby, for this really insightful discussion on fundraising in challenging times. We'll just open the floor for the startup founders on this call. If they have any question, please feel free to drop it in the comment zone. I'm definitely sure that we'll be able to pick one or two questions from that bit to send across to our panelists. If not, I can gladly hand over the floor to Joshua, who will then take us to the next agenda on the list.
Thank you so much, Keith. Thank you very much. Very impactful session. Let's just open it up to the members of the cohort to ask their questions.
It's got to be some question, unless everyone's got their rounds filled, which would be a good thing too.
Hi everyone. This is Washington from Zemocad. Thank you for organizing for this very, insightful session. This is actually our second session. We just joined officially the cohort today, so we are a bit of a late entrance. But I'd just like to ask one question in terms of how investors and VCs view startups. And I know one factor is on the potential for return on investment, and or if they'd like to invest on something that has an impact, as was said. But what particularly do they look at, or the criteria they use when they're evaluating the founders themselves? What are some of the things that they look out for in terms of the composition of the founders?
I think there's lots of...
Okay, Derek, you have the floor.
I mean, I could just say a couple. I mean, with just identifying what we look for in founders, I think it's a track record of success That doesn't necessarily mean you need to have done other startups, but I do like to hear what you've worked hard at and achieved and won. Definitely an understanding of how you came together as founders. And one of the things I always say to founders is, and to the CEO, is when you get to that founder slide, I want you to say to me, I have the best team in the world to bring this to market, not the most convenient team. Because I think a lot of times founders like have a great idea and they know Jack over here who can do some coding and Jerry who can do some design, and they just find the most convenient team versus the best team. And so I oftentimes want to understand why you're the best team in the world to bring this to market, how long you've been working together, and what you guys have achieved either successfully together or apart. That's three things for you. I'm sure there's more.
Okay, thank you very much.
Thanks, Derek.
Sorry. So this is Davis from Zemocard. What we basically do is we help businesses manage their expenditure by eliminating wasteful spending, and also issue credit for managing cash flow. So my question is, whenever we approach, or when we've just started basically approaching investors, there's that criteria of they want to see your TAM to be a huge market, right? But what type of criteria is that? Because some businesses essentially would not necessarily grow to $1 billion, right? Or wouldn't even attain that type of revenue mark. Some might just get to 100 million or $10 million or something of that sort. So what type of criteria is actually looked at? Because anytime we've spoken to one or two VCs, they have that idea, okay, at least from what I've heard or from what I've understood, is this market has to be big. But what is that big? What is that? Yeah.
I mean, I could take that one too if you guys want.
Yeah, I can take it. It's fine.
Go ahead. Yeah,
sure. So I think the way to frame that is, first, what is venture capital, right? Ultimately, venture capital, some people, there are all sorts of definitions, but I think one I like is they say venture capital invests in the future, right? It's essentially believes that it's investing in businesses that have a much greater future value than they currently hold. So by virtue of the fact that you are seeking venture capital, there'll always be an eye on exponential growth. Like, you just can't escape that, right? And, let's be frank, it's just because startups get a lot of press. There are also all sorts of businesses that are not funded by VCs that are doing exceptionally well. They are funded by friends and families and angels and, and even self-funded and growing off their own revenue. But once you want to come for VC funding, you have to expect that you'll be asked for exponential scale, because like with every VC, just like the little maths that Derek spoke about, there's an expectation that a large part of that portfolio will not be the ones to return that fund. It will just be a few. So always keep at the back of your mind that you need to be able to demonstrate that your business can scale and scale quickly. So things like, your target addressable market, how many people out there are really your customers or potentially are your customers, right? The market need you're addressing. I've seen many investment decisions go south because VCs just say, what, we don't think this market need is big enough for us to serve. Things around scale, like even how many countries can this solution be useful in? And if for example, your target addressable market is not attractive within just maybe one country, right? How many markets can this scale into? So I think when it comes to VC funding, you have to be able to find ways to demonstrate that exponential growth, and usually looking at things like I said, target addressable market, the market need, what are your annual rates of returns, what do you think your average revenue per user, and how many of those users, and if you're able to demonstrate traction that you have gotten a certain type of user, a certain type of customer, what are you going to do to be able to make sure that more of that type of customer, essentially, you can get more of those. So just things that demonstrate that ability to scale exponentially are very critical for any VC.
Right.
So something else.
Okay, and I get that, and I appreciate that. But my main question would, because obviously we would demonstrate exponential growth, right? Mm-hmm. But what is that measurement for each particular VC? Because let's say I would have our market is about $4 billion worth, right? And
so let me tell you something.
Yes, go ahead.
A $4 billion market, if you pitched that to me and said you're going to be $1 billion company, I would pass. I'm just being blunt, because a $4 billion market and you're going to take 1/4 of that market. Now you're pinning me down, and that means there's only going to be one unicorn in that market, and you're pinning me down to say you are that unicorn. So what I look at is, what's the ratio of the market size I assess? I definitely will listen to what your market size is, but I'll assess the market, and then I'll think, how big can you be? And is there a lot of unicorns in there? That's where I like to see. So like when I was looking at a robotics company, we assessed it at $100 billion. There's plenty of robotic unicorns that are already there, but there's also room for another one. And I don't have to pick the winner necessarily, but I could still get a unicorn out of it. And so even if you are, for those of you looking at smaller markets, if you're saying you got $100 million business, there's nothing wrong with that. You probably wouldn't get venture capital, but you can go to banks and go to angels. But you would want to have $100 million business in like a $4 billion market. So you could be believable, right, that you're going to have a decent size of the market, and you don't have to say you are number one, because there's going to be a lot of skepticism with that, in my opinion.
Gotcha. So let me just summarize and clarify if I'm wrong. So yes, in our market, in the Kenyan market specifically, yes, we are it's a $4 billion market, but obviously in the sub-Saharan market, it's way larger than that, right? So what you're basically saying is I should be able to compile that entire market, right? But also show that we can scale to a certain level if it's a fourth of that or something of that sort, right?
Yeah. And start small and think big. And you don't have to tell me you're going to have like $2 billion next year, but, extrapolate it into a very large market and, be able to articulate a path to get there and understand that, but, be rational about it. There's nothing wrong with dominating Kenya and then going to the rest of sub-Saharan Africa.
Makes sense. Awesome. Thank you so much.
Yeah.
Do we have any other question? I think someone asked a question in the chat box, so I'm just going to pick that out. So the question is, and it's from Busayo Omoni from PayIve. The question is, in raising seed funds as founders, should we focus more on angel investors or VCs? So who would want to take that question?
So I think I'll answer that with a question, and the question is, how large is the seed round that you're raising, right? Because with every industry, seed rounds are going to vary. With potentially industries that have wider reach, wider markets, you'll see larger rounds across all the stages of the fundraising journey. And that's basically why fintech is doing what it's doing right now in Africa, right? So the question is, how large is the seed round? And then you now ask yourself a question in that market, what is the typical, who typically funds that round, right? So if you are thinking of a seed round and you're looking at maybe below $1 million, thereabouts, you'll know that most of the time, if that's the entire size, maybe you're better off looking at angels or micro VCs versus traditional sort of like VCs who will play a bit more close to like maybe pre-Series A or Series A. So it just basically depends on the size of the round and who typically funds those type of rounds in that market.
I agree. I mean, I think there's a lot of emphasis on this pre-seed, seed A stuff. I think it's friends, family, fools, and founders is round one. Round two is typically angels. And then you should really put off venture capital as long as you can. And once you really know what your growth triggers are, and you're really ready to grow like a rocket ship, and you really know, you give me $1 million, X million comes out, that's when I would put off venture. That's the most optimal time for venture capital in terms of dilution and getting and using them in their network is best, because that's really what they're good at. So I would put off VC as long as you have. Now, I think the other thing to say is, if you're a first-time founder, I would not be in this optimizing fundraising stuff. So I think all these questions are good and right to ask in some sense, but they really apply more to like Sam, like a multiple-time founder who's got this game down, and he's going to just optimize his raises. I think if it's your first time, you really just need to beg, borrow, deal, get the money in however you can. And you might not be able to optimize your first company, but you'll be able to do it the second and the third time. I think that's one thing that doesn't get talked about enough.
Speaking of things that don't get talked about enough, there's grants out there, right? So a lot of what we do at Catalyst Fund is grants. A lot of companies do grants, but I think in the case of grants, because most of them are driven by impact, so your ability to clearly state your sort of like the impact you're going to have, right? The impact metrics, the way you measure your impact measurements, that's also potentially a good channel to raise funding, because most of the time with grants, you don't have to worry about dilution and all that, right? And repayment and debts and all that. But I'll tell you for a fact that most of the time, most grants funds are not even struggle to even deploy the entire capital, just because a lot of people are not conscious of the organizations out there that give grants and are also not able to have the right kind of impact metrics or measurements that can, facilitate access to those grants. So yeah, also keep grants at the back of your mind.
Very, very, very great addition to that point, Nosa. So there's a final question here in the chat box. When is it too early? And I think we've already sort of like addressed that a bit, but I'm just going to echo that out. When is it too early to meet VCs for funding, and when is the right time to do so? I think Derek already sort of like touched a bit on this particular question, and I hope Emma from Scalers, you were able to pick that response in that regards. So I think this is the right time to hand over the floor to Joshua, and then we can just wrap up the conversation.
Thank you so much, Gift. I'll be wrapping up for Joshua. Thank you again to our panelists, Derek, Nosa, Ruby, Samuel, Gift, for moderating the panel today. Thank you so much for your time. Thank you also for extending your time with us this evening. It's been a very rewarding panel discussion today. I'm sure the founders have been able to get so much insightful ideas from you on how they can approach some of their plans around fundraising in the coming months. Thank you so much again for taking out the time to be with us today. I'm wishing everyone a lovely evening, afternoon, morning, whatever time it is where you're at.
Thank
Bye,
you.
everyone.
Have a great day. Bye.
Thank
Bye,
Bye.
everyone.
Bye, everyone.
Bye, everyone.
Bye.
Thank you.